The story of Obito Uchiha is told by Darius the Green Angel. Let's go back, a couple years. Not a couple years, a long time ago, I guess. Like I always do, right? Obito is a boy in the Hidden Leaf. He's a Uchiha, you know, but he's kind of like Naruto a little bit. He has dreams to become Hokage, but he has, people in his class like Kakashi, who's like really fucking good. A true prodigy, Kakashi is, you know, and he's always getting outdone by Kakashi. Not just Kakashi, but everybody else in class. He has a crush on a girl named Rin. And, this is my second favorite character in Naruto. Obito, you know, wasn't great, in school. He was the last one to, graduate from the academy. Even Mike Guy, a guy who had no talent for jutsu, did better than him in the Chunin exams. Beat him down. Eventually, one day, Obito was called to a mission. This was during the Third Great Shinobi War. He was growing up during that time. So at like 12 or 13, he was doing his thing, right? And Kakashi, got promoted to Jonin class, that day. His sensei, the Yellow Flash, had real missions to do, on another battlefield, because this was one of the wars. So they had to complete another mission. Kakashi, had a father too at one point, right? But his father died because he killed himself. Because he wasn't even called to the Shinobi Creed, right? But Kakashi was gonna do that, and be the best ninja he could be, even if he had to do other things. Minato left Kakashi with the um, special kunai that he used, and then he went to the battlefield somewhere else. Rock Shinobi, Hidden Stone Shinobi, came up on Rin and took her. Obito was like, hey, we need to go save Rin. She's a part of our group. Kakashi, what are we doing? Kakashi's like, we're sticking to the mission. We're gonna forget about her. She was weak. She got caught. We have to move forward. And he was like, no, we have to go back for her. And he was like, convinced by Obito, that basically, you are worse than scum if you, turn your back on your friends. So he was like, okay, we'll go save Rin. But he went by himself at first, and then Kakashi came. Obito awakened the Sharingan during that time, and they were defeating the enemy. Him and Kakashi. They grabbed Rin and they were escaping. However, they set bombs in the cave, and the rock crushed half of Obito's body. Obito was then, in a bad spot. He was like, I'm a goner, but before I go, take my eye, Kakashi, and we'll always be connected that way. Kakashi took his eye, and then from that day on, he got the moniker of the Copy Ninja, Kakashi of the Sharingan Eye, and he, continued to be a great ninja. Obito wasn't dead though; he didn't die that day. And Obito did want to go back to the Leaf. He did want to become a shinobi. He did want to, see his friends again. He wanted to see Minato and everybody else. However, he was saved by Madara Uchiha. And if we know anything about Madara Uchiha, we know he's against the Hidden Leaf. And their ideas and everything else. Madara saw the young Obito as a guy who could complete his plans, as he was an old man at that point. He also evaded death too. So he used Obito as a means to, or he was going to use him as a means to do that. But first, certain things had to happen. Obito had to have the hatred in his heart to move forward with the plans that Madara wanted to lay out for him. He's like, you will be the one I use to create this new world. The reality of this world is harsh, so I'll create a new one, in my image, that type of thing, with the infinite Tsukuyomi. Obito wasn't hearing it at first. He stayed with Madara for a while until he could move. Then he was like, I'm going back to the Hidden Leaf Village. He ended up, leaving the cave with the power of Zetsu. He was able to run around. Zetsu had told him that Kakashi and Rin were running away from Mist Ninja, and they were like, in a bad situation. They were like surrounded essentially. Obito was trying to get there in time, but when he got there, he witnessed Kakashi kill Rin, turning his whole life upside down. He liked Rin a lot. Rin liked Kakashi a lot. They were all, on the same team together. And when he saw Rin die, that really, turned his eyes on, because Uchiha, when, they experience a lot of pain, and they lose somebody they care about, love a lot, their eyes, become like that. And after that happened, Obito went off. He killed all the Mist Ninja in the area, and he awakened the Mangekyou Sharingan. And he could then bypass, or he could be, impervious or whatever. He could, permeate through things, He could move through walls and objects and everything else, right? Kakashi had the other part of his eye, so Kakashi could, send things to another world. The Kamui world. Now, Obito could do this. Now, he could send his body there. And he could also send people there, but he had to, be up close. Kakashi was, more long range. He could do that from a distance. Obito, but Obito was cool with it. He, worked with his Mangekyou Sharingan for a little bit, and then he attacked the Hidden Leaf Village. First, he grabbed the Nine Tails out of Kushina, and then he, summoned it, and then, put it under his control, and he was attacking the Hidden Leaf Village. Minato was there. He encountered his sensei then. He had a great fight with his sensei. His sensei, was, kind of wondering who it was. Madara, who he said he was, but something didn't seem right. He won a bit, not too easy, but it would have been harder if it was the real Madara and shit. Obito was defeated that day, and then Naruto, the legend of Naruto, started, that day too. But Obito was still running around and shit. He then approached, Nagato and Conan. And he was like, hey, I have you guys, and we can create a better world together. I see the potential here. We can, do this. With your eyes, Nagato, you can do shit like that. First Nagato was, not hearing it. The Akatsuki wasn't that. The Akatsuki was, another idea, Yahiko and their idea of creating a better rain village. But Obito took that and played games with it after Yahiko died. And he was like, hey, guess what? We can bring back Yahiko too. Everything will be better once we use the infinite Tsukuyomi. But we have to catch the tail beast. 10 tails must, be created and everything else to bring this world stability and peace and harmony. But we first got to destroy it. We got to take these tail beasts. We got to, let the world know that we mean business. You know, Obito then recruited a whole bunch of Akatsuki members. He went to the Hidden Mist Village and played games with Yagura, the Three Tails, who was also the fourth Mizukage. When he did that, he also took Yagura, but the Three Tails escaped. Well, she had to go catch the Three Tails later with Deidara. But then he also recruited Itachi. But when he fucked with Yagura, he recruited Kisame, and then he recruited Itachi. He then helped Itachi, slaughter the Uchiha clan. You know, Obito, killed people too, in his own clan. Yeah. He had eyes, for himself too, because he knew of the Izanagi and Izanami techniques. Obito did. He took those eyes and he, hid them somewhere. Danzo got a hold of some of them too, eventually. Obito was an Akatsuki member, but he was moving in the shadows. Only four Akatsuki members knew about him. The other 5 didn't know shit. They knew it to be pain and shit, right? Obito joined the Akatsuki as Toby after the death of Sasori. He took on that mission with Deidara to catch the Three Tails, and they did. He was running around with Deidara for a little bit, and then Sasuke appeared. He took note of Sasuke's techniques and shit. Sasuke tried to cut him down, he bypassed, the sword passed through him, and he was just kind of watching on the side, acting like an idiot the whole time, as he's like a side character in the Akatsuki. But really, he's running the whole, thing himself. And Deidara had no idea. But he was, there, and he saw, Sasuke's prowess against Deidara, understanding that he was actually trying to go after Itachi. He killed Orochimaru for that purpose. He was there for that purpose. He was knowledgeable on all kinds of things. Obito, encountered Naruto, and, and the rest of the people were looking for Sasuke, Then his, true form came out, and he wasn't hiding no more. He was like, okay, now Sasuke killed Itachi. Now I can approach Sasuke. I can have him, become an asset to us too. He now has eyes like me, He told him about Itachi and how Danzo Shimura, helped feel shit like that, the slaughter of the Uchiha clan. That gave Sasuke an extra power boost, hatred, towards the Hidden Leaf Elders specifically. Obito still needed the 8 and 9 tails, so he told Sasuke to go after Killer B. Sasuke went after Killer B, but he evaded him. Killer B, that is, evaded Sasuke. And then he was like, that was a failed mission, but, I'll still tell you about Danzo. Because I need, something from Danzo too. Obito, helped Sasuke get to the 5 Kage summit. He took Fu and Torne into his world to use them later. But he he, did that, and he was, running around, right? Sitting down during that fight, watching Danzo. he knew Danzo wanted to like try to put him under Genjutsu and shit, but he wasn't worried about it because he knew Sasuke was gonna grow in power, and he was just watching the whole thing go down. And then he would be a power during the war he was about to start, which he told the five Kage about, the plan for Infinite Tsukiyomi and what it would require, all nine-tailed beasts to create the 10 tails, and he would become like Hagoromo, and do that shit. But Danzo Shimura ended up losing, but he took the eye with him, and the eye was gone, so Obito was pissed. But he still had another, plan. Nagato's eyes were part of the plan too, but things didn't work out the way, Madara wanted. You know, Obito went after Nagato's eyes. You know, Obito went after Nagato's eyes. He had to fight against Conan, which he should have beat easily, right? But Conan, he kind of was like dropped the cigar, and he's like, "Man, she's weak. I won't fucking lose to her." She ended up summoning like 6 billion paper bombs or some shit she had planned in them, like in the sea. And he almost died almost. But he used Izanagi to save himself. Rewriting it as a dream and everything else, and then he plugged in the Renegon in one of his eyes, and the other eye was somewhere else. He then made moves too. Kabuto Yakashi. Kabuto Yakashi, came up with the plan to, summon, undead soldiers, Kage, former Seven Ninja Swordsmen, Leaf Shinobi, Keke Genkai users of certain styles, Gold and Silver Brothers, um, Madara Uchiha himself, which Obito was caught off guard. He's like, "How'd you find that?" He's like, "Hey man, it's our little secret, but we're doing this together, And he's like, "All right, but if you play games, I will kill you and shit." He then went on the move with the Jinchuriki. He put the six pass power on him. So basically what Nagato was doing with his, paths of pain, he was doing that with the, tail beast, the Jinchuriki. He then found Naruto and Killer Bee. They ended up pulling up on him. And he was fighting against them for a while. Then Kakashi and Guy came, and they were fighting all together. They were starting to learn about Obito's moves. They still knew that they didn't know who it was exactly. But Kakashi was like, his moves look similar to mine. I'll send you into, wherever he's at, and you can break that mask. And that's what Naruto did. Boom. The mask broke, and they found out it was Obito. Kakashi was like, "What? We thought you were dead." Obito was like, "Yeah, well, I'm still here. And, Rin died, but I can bring her back. You had your losses too. You thought that I was dead for all this time. You had a lot of pain from that, Kakashi. This will all go away once, this happens and this happens, But he fought Kakashi also in the Kamui world. It was a great fight too. Kakashi was actually doing pretty damn good against Obito. Obito ended up getting out of there. He became the Ten Tails Jinchuriki, the first one seen since, Hagoromo, right? Or, whatever, right? So he wasn't perfect, though. He didn't have the 8 and 9 tails. He was kind of losing his mind at first, but then he was starting to grasp his powers. But then Naruto started talking to him after a while. He got into his inner world, and he was like, you wanted to be the Hokage. Where'd you go wrong? He's like, no. He's like, Naruto's like, yes, you did. In another fucking, universe, you could have been my sensei, shit like that. He started talking to him. Obito started to see things, and see how he was wrong, and all the things that he did and everything else. His sensei was recouped. Kakashi was going to take Obito's life after he came back, but Minato was like, no. Obito, you know, will do whatever, he's on our side now or whatever. But then Zetsu came into play. Zetsu took control of Obito's body and had him use running rebirth on Madara. Then, Obito couldn't move. He was kind of, almost useless, basically. Um, and he was like, damn, I can't, do this. Because he had the Ten Tails power and then it came out of him. So, like, when a tail beast is attracted from a person, you know, they end up dying, but he's the Ten Tails, so it's different with the Ten Tails Jinchuriki. You can still survive. But it took a lot out of him and shit. He was like fucked up. So he was like, yeah, Madara is gonna try to become the Ten Tails. He did, and then Kaguya was summoned. When Kaguya was summoned, Obito was still, he wasn't under the influence of the only. He was there with Kakashi, Sakura, Naruto, and Sasuke. Um, then he jumped in the way of the attack, saving Naruto and Sasuke, and then bestowing, powers onto Kakashi once again. Both double Mangekyo Sharingan so that they could defeat Kaguya. He was a broken character. The boy, saw a girl die. He had dreams to become Hokage, in another world he might have, maybe, possibly though, but Obito was a great villain. He fooled a lot of people, but he got fooled himself too. That was the thing about Naruto that was crazy, Obito, fooled a lot of people into believing he was Madara and other things, and he was a great shinobi too, like as far as power goes and everything else. He ran shit with a lot of people. He had great fights and everything else. And he was great at, his moves and everything else. Pretty unique style of Mangekyo Sharingan and things too. But